like it. That's my kind of font. Yeah, just leave it right there. It's just me that's going to introduce you. Can I make sure you're turned on?
I trust her. There's no money in it, so I can trust her. I, okay. Okay, are we starting?
Yeah, you ready?
Oh, I'm ready whenever you
Okay.
Okay.
Good evening. Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer and this Wednesday's installment of the Voices series. I'm David Ware, member of the clergy team here, and I'm so glad to welcome you. Back in 1983, academics Elmer and Joanne Martin took the money that they had saved up for a down payment on a house, and instead they bought 4 wax figures, which they then took on a traveling exhibition to churches, schools, and shopping malls. How many of you, instead of buying your first house, bought 4 wax figures? That's how it all got started. The project eventually grew to include 150 figures and a permanent home on North Avenue in East Baltimore, the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum. The Martins' genius was to subordinate the usual explanatory text panels and museum labels to a direct and visceral experience of the historical conditions that their exhibits describe. From the very first, they envisioned the museum not as an entertaining pastime, but as a teaching tool to address today's most pressing concerns: the unequal justice meted out to blacks by the criminal justice system, the growing economic inequality along racial lines, and the continuing problem of police violence and brutality against communities of color. The museum does not shy away from making moral comparisons between the events of America's past and their troubling legacy today. Sadly, Dr. Elmer Martin passed away while the couple was traveling in 2001 in Egypt. But Dr. Joanne Martin continues their shared legacy today. She performs just a second. She performs most of the museum's curatorial duties and has laid the groundwork for both the architectural and exhibition design, and I'm sure she'll tell you for an exciting planned expansion. May I present to you Dr. Joanne Martin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I was told that I needed to emote so that people in the back could hear me. So people in the back, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I have chosen as my topic for this evening the journey to becoming Black and no longer colored or Negro. About mid-2022, the museum participated in a program, Doors Open Baltimore, sponsored by the Baltimore Architectural Foundation. And it was a tour of historically significant places around Baltimore. And for the museum, it was a tour of the Schmidt Mansion. The museum is located in the heart of East Baltimore in a fragile community. On one corner, on the corner of Bond and North Avenue, is what was formerly the firehouse, still referred to as the firehouse. And that's where most of the museum's collection is located. And then on the other end, on North Avenue and Broadway, is the Schmidt Mansion. The Schmidt Mansion is the story of the Georges. George Schmidt, who was a beer baron in Baltimore, who had the house built. George Frederick, who was the architect who took that commission, but also he was the architect for Baltimore City Hall. And then George Sander, of George Sander and Son Funeral Home. When you're in the wax figure business, you try not to use words like funeral home. Because there are people, we haven't convinced them that someone didn't give us Frederick Douglass, we dug him up and put him in wax. I made the statement through my presentation that white is not something that you are, but something that you become. And I went on to say that white people have described their journey as becoming American. But in essence, it has been a journey that involved becoming white. Again, white is not something that you are, but something that you become. And I gave as an example the Pinkster holiday. The Pinkster, meaning Pentecostal, was a holiday brought to observance brought to America by the Dutch who settled New York. And New York had a large slave population. Many people don't know that New York was so enamored of slavery that it considered withdrawing from the Union, seceding from the Union, and joining the Confederacy. But with the Pinkster holiday, because of the large slavery population, that also meant that there would have been a free black community as well. And so the Pinkster holiday was very much celebrated by the slave and free black community. The slaves could get a day off, and they could come to the festival. There was a large festival, and they could come there and sell their wares. Free blacks could do the same thing, and then free blacks could participate in the marketing because they could stand next to a booth that one of the Dutch people had and bring the crowds in. And it was a way to get a day off from the harsh labor of slavery and slavery-era labor. Eventually, and up to today, Pinkster is considered to be an African-American holiday. It evolved over time, in part because, again, the participation that you had of slaves and free men, free people of color. But also because the Dutch no longer wanted to be seen as foreigners. And the Dutch began to embrace those holidays that would identify them as American. 4th of July, Christmas traditions in the American fashion of celebrating those holidays. For the Bauernschmidt Mansion, where the museum, that is in, as I said, on the corner of North Avenue and Broadway, and where our offices are located, the Germans were white, and they could reject other groups like the Irish and the Italians, which they did. And when you look today at today's white Christian nationalism, it bears our giving it some attention. Because what it signifies is that there is a claimed right by this ideology of white Christian nationalism to determine who deserves to be American and therefore who deserves to be white. And therefore they have defined that as white, Anglo-Saxon, Christian, but Christian meaning Protestant. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The idea that when I thought that there was a certain brilliance when I'm coming up with the idea that white is not something that you are, but something that you become, but you have a number of scholars and authors with book titles such as, and reference works such as The Wages of Whiteness, how the Irish became white, how Jews became white folks and what that says about race in America, whiteness of a different color, working toward whiteness, how America's immigrants became white. And one of those authors, Rediger, says, contemporary debates over whether some Asian Americans, Arab Americans, and Latinos are or might become white have given this literature an urgency and edge. Other titles by Rediger, Working Toward Whiteness, How America's Immigrants Became White, The Strange Journey from Ellis Island to the Suburbs, How Italians Became White. But I'm not here, as I indicated at first. My topic is the journey of becoming black and no longer Negro and colored. So the journey, we're going to start the journey with the arrival as slaves and, of course, then and free men. But particularly with the Emancipation Proclamation, and again, those were the designations. Enslaved, we say we prefer enslaved, but the designation was slaves, and the designation was free men and free persons of color. With the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, it was decided by the former slaves and free people that they needed another designation, a designation that they could give themselves. And that designation was colored. In the 1920s, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey and others decided that they preferred Negro. And so there was often not a coming to agreement about what those terms were, and in some cases, the legal definition and so forth, but those two terms that coexisted. But more than anything, those people who embraced the notion of being colored or Negro were looking for a way to not let the designation be the N-word. If this were not live streamed, I'm not one to use the euphemism of the N-word. I feel that it gives it a validity and a respectability that the hatred of it, the evil within it, does not deserve. But this is being live streamed, so I'm going to adhere to the rules, and Raina will shut my mic off. So. I was also going to tell you my N-word story. My first encounter with that word as a designation for me, 8-year-old me, by a little 8-year-old white boy. But since it loses something in the telling when you don't hear the evil of that word, or of an 8-year-old child who was already learning white supremacy and who felt the need to use that word to refer to me and my cousins. So we're going to fast forward to the 1960s, the late 1960s and the early 1970s, with the advent of the Black Power, Black consciousness, civil rights movements, when a young generation declared ourselves black and rejected the notion of being Negro and colored. And in order to make that more than simply empty words, they created what I'm calling the psychology of blackness infrastructure. And that infrastructure manifested itself through things like Black Power, Black Liberation, Black Panthers. So using those terms became a part of the blackness psychology of blackness infrastructure. You also infused popular culture with it. So say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Black is beautiful. And at the foundation of this blackness infrastructure was the idea that black is not a color, but a state of mind. Black is not a color, but a state of mind, which meant that you had to become black here, where it counted. But did that work? Was the infrastructure strong enough? We consider that despite this effort to create a blackness infrastructure, for generations, blackness had been, and it continues to be, defined as color. People talk about all the time, I'm judged by my color. Certainly not the content of your character that Martin Luther King talked about. But the builders of this infrastructure understood that the infrastructure was needed to get rid of this frame of mind that black is a color, and therefore the idea that black is not a color, but a state of mind. Again, did it work? In early 1980s, and I say that Elmer's and my journey toward creating the national, what is now the National Great Blacks in Wax Museum, started when Elmer sponsored a Little League baseball team of inner city children. He had ID pictures taken of them so that they could play in the league. And one of the kids came up to him angry, crying, just fists clenched, and demanded that Elmer make the photographer take the picture over, saying to Elmer, they got me too black in this picture. I don't want to be as black as they got me in this picture. Remember, we had the infrastructure. So black power and black is beautiful and black and proud, but they got me too black in this picture. So we recognize that the struggle continues. The journey has to, I have to mention that the journey ends maybe, and maybe begins, I'm not sure, but the journey brings us to black versus African American. That was a very, very important part of the journey as well. The American part of it, for the assimilationists and the integrationists, had the same motives that the Italians and the Irish had, and other groups of American, and this quest for American. But to the militants and the radicals, it meant we have fought for this country, we have died for this country, we have every right to claim our place as Americans, and you will not deny us that, because we will go to the streets and whatever. So that was the push and pull of the American part of that. The African part of that, with the radicals, we will no longer be defined by the Tarzan movies and Cheetah, who has more power than we do. So that was a part of it. But the African part of it also, and what so many of us embrace, I have Griot, Deborah Pierce Fakunle, Griot meaning storyteller, who's in the audience, and but the cultural part of embracing our Africanity, the cultural part of looking at the ways in which we have had an impact on the culture of this nation. And so you get sort of the combination you will not take our culture away. You will not take our right to participate in this country away, but also that our dance and our music and our spirituality and all of those things that also define what this journey has been to becoming Black and African American. And if you look, and when you do surveys, they recognize that it doesn't have to be an either or. That you get, so on surveys, they say you check off, they have Black/African American. So just that kind of thing that has led and defines our journey. But as I said earlier, the whole notion of white Christian nationalism deserves our paying attention, because someone has decided that they are claiming the right to determine who is American and who is not. And it boils down to, again, what it has boiled down for those people who felt the right to claim that, to white, Anglo-Saxon, Christian, which is Protestant. So there are many of us still in the fight, be they immigrants or whatever group, the fight to not allow anyone to have any kind of power over whether we belong, whether this is our country, our democracy. And we have to fight for that. Because if we don't fight, if we don't see that we are all in this together, that we simply cannot afford those forces of evil and hatred to win, then it could be the destruction of us all. Thank you.
I'd love to invite folks to come to the microphone and ask questions, if that's okay, Dr. Martin.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, good. And I can come to you, or y'all can come to the microphone. You have choices.
I guess I get to be the first one. In 1967, when I was in the Episcopal Youth Fellowship here in this church, there was a meeting in the parish hall that had members of the Black Panthers and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and other groups came. And I don't remember, I was a teenager. I do not remember who got the groups to come to speak to us, but we met in the parish hall. And at that time, what struck me was how disparate we were. It was like the Grand Canyon. We were on one side of the canyon, and the speakers who were here were on the other side of the canyon. And it was like we weren't related at all. And then the strangest thing happened, and I really haven't thought about it very much until I heard your address until now. And so my question is, how much did other factors come into account? And I'm going to say in the 1960s, and I'm going to name one specific example, that started to change the mindset of people, not just whites, not just blacks, but people in general. And the example that I'd like to use is soul music, Berry Gordy and Motown. Because what strikes me listening to you, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, is that myself and other white teenagers started not to think so much in terms of the Grand Canyon racial divides, because we were all dancing to and loving and singing soul music. So how much effect did other factors, external factors, come into play in changing the way people transformed over time into, we haven't made a whole lot of progress, but to where we are today?
I agree with you that, and again, this blackness infrastructure and the need to use popular culture as a way of cementing the blackness, making that proclamation. And most certainly that when they talk about music as a universal language, and you had parents who were fighting, white parents fighting their kids bringing in that music into their homes, but they did it anyway. And you began to have programs that were popular and where they could actually listen to it, like Dick Clark's American Bandstand and so forth. But kids sneaking to listen to soul stations. And so that as a factor, it didn't necessarily, because so many of them had been immersed in this whole notion of white supremacy. So you continue to have to fight that. But there was an opening of minds in a way that parents fought against for a while. Just the whole notion that none of us here will use the term Negro and colored. You've been able to erase that from the lexicon. The civil rights movement, that you had people of various races who joined in protesting, and who joined in demanding that we get rid of Jim Crow, and who fought against some of the horrors of lynching, and were willing to declare that this is wrong. So that as a factor. It is not an accident that education was used as it is today, unfortunately, but fortunately, then education was used as the way to end segregation. Brown versus Board of Education, that declared school segregation illegal. Kids going to school with one another, white kids and black kids and Latino kids and kids of all different races and ethnicities, for the first time in their lives, coming together. It didn't mean that we didn't have the Boston where they fought vociferously against it, or that the whole idea of Ellis Island to the suburbs, that you had the white flight and all of that. You had money taken away from schools in an effort to still carry on a segregation within the schools. But it began with the notion that if we can start children early in accepting one another, getting to know one another, then we can create a more just society. I was doing a tour at the museum once. It was a group of kids from Baltimore County, and there were two white students in the group, two white males, and it was clear on their faces that the museum was the last place in the world they wanted to be. And I'd been pressed into service because one of our tour guides didn't come in, and I'm doing the tour, and one of them stopped me in mid-sentence and said, "Why do we have to be here today?" And there was such anger on both their faces, the kid, but one of them asked the question. And some of the kids, they did the ooh, and they thought, some of them were kind of chiding him on, like, "Oh yeah, good, get her." And some of them, "How dare you insult this lady like this or be so rude?" And then the teacher, very, very embarrassed. And I took a breath and I said, when I look around at this group, I see that the majority of you are white. I see some African Americans or blacks. I see some Latino students. And I see some that I'm going to refer to as other. But whatever your race, color, ethnicity, you are the ones that I have to depend on, that my generation is depending on to lead this world. And if you have any chance of being a good father or construction worker or minister or doctor or housekeeper, a part of what will make you effective in that role is learning the stories that make up who we are as a United States of America, learning those narratives. That's the only way we have any chance that you will be a good one of those. And so for me, you get to learn today the story of people of African descent and their contribution to the making and shaping of this world. And that, for me, is why you're here today. And when I finished, he did this and said, "I got it." The other kid didn't miss a beat. The anger was still there. He wanted to call it something, but I reached one of them, and then I said to him, "I'd like you to know that I know that it took a lot of courage for you to ask that question, but you asked it, and had you not asked it, then I wouldn't have gotten the opportunity to answer it. And you and I would have missed, and all this group would have missed an opportunity to have a conversation. And so I want to thank you for allowing me to have a conversation. And I thank God for giving me the humility to do so." Thank you for your question.
Good evening, Dr. Martin. Thanks for being here. My husband and I had the opportunity to go to your museum a few weeks ago, and it was a very powerful experience. And I understand that you have plans to expand the museum, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
We have plans to expand. Absolutely. We need to, well, first off, the museum is deliberately located in a fragile community of East Baltimore. My husband, Elmer, said community development and cultural development go hand in hand. He said that conventional wisdom all over this nation is that you hide your poverty areas, and once you succeed in hiding them, then you can succeed in neglecting them. And so that's why we're there in that community. And when we moved in, we knew that, I'm from Florida, and I know that I can always, when I was growing up, you could always see those things around you. And that's the mindset, that you can see that. And I had people laughing recently that I get these stories from kids who tell me, adults now in their 40s who say, and I was at your museum when I was in 5th grade. So there's something about the 5th grade, because even Senator Corey McCray, whom we loved, talks about when he was in 5th grade coming to the museum. So there is something about 5th grade. But we want a museum that can tell the story, not just the 5,000 years of history that we tell now, but 250,000 years of history that talks about this African man and woman that was responsible for the DNA in all of us. That's an important part of the story, that we moved out of Africa and across continents, and because of climate and an elongated nose or lighter skin and so forth, but that starting point, that's the story we want to tell. And we need the space to do that. We have programs that I'm very proud of, like our docent training program for youth, where we train them to be tour guides in the museum. Last night we had Erin Naomi Reed, who is a part of our growing griot literacy learning program, and she, at Senator McCray's event, she came up all 14 years old of her. I'm Shirley Chisholm. I was the first black woman to run for president. So being able to tell those stories and develop our youth. But we've shown that people will come into our neighborhood because Great Blacks in Wax is there. And so we've been trying to get the city to understand we've shown that tourism can thrive in this area, because our visitors come from out of state, the majority of them. And they come from New York and New Jersey, and during spring break they're going to come from parts of the South. And I was told, Eric is back there, so he does he's involved in the spreadsheets and all of that with the tour groups that are coming. And I was told that we have a group coming from LA, because they go on the college tour. They bring young kids, whatever age, maybe middle school kids, across the country to get an experience of what college could be like. And so to start planting that seed early on. But they come from farther and farther distances, and it depends on the time of year and so forth. We want the space to be able to give them a positive experience where they're not crowded. COVID created its own set of circumstances for all of us, but being able to have a museum that can serve as a catalyst for tourism, that can serve our community, provide jobs, and that can be an educational force, especially in a time today when you're not supposed to say black and race and so forth, or where there is an effort to see to it that our history is once again written out of the textbooks and the books. Thank you.
I did have a question for you, but I think before I ask the question, I want to address your question a little bit. Dr. Martin doesn't like to talk too much about this sort of thing. We're in the midst of a $12 million renovation and expansion project that we're working on for about, we expect to have it, hope to have it done within 2 years. And so beginning this fall, we're hoping to be able to do a major gut renovation of the firehouse. And then after that, we will start with new construction there on site. And so we're excited about that and looking forward to it. But in between, we're going to need about a year to do a temporary temporary location. And so we're in the process of looking for the temporary location while we're actually closed. We just completed a major restoration of the exterior of the firehouse, which took us, how long, Bill? A year? 2 years. So just the exterior was way over $1 million to do that. So, and then after that, we're looking forward to completing the rest of the block, which is probably about a $100 million project of expansion for the rest of the block there for that. So, okay. My question is, I think we're all aware of what's been happening somewhat in Florida, but all around the country, in which there is a concerted effort, somehow under the guise of critical race theory and those sort of things, to silence much of the history of the experience of African Americans in our country. And in light of much of that history being taken out of schools, books being removed from libraries. I remember how important it was when I read Maya Angelou and the biography of Malcolm X, having grown up in all-white schools from first grade on, and I remember how important those books were for me. In light of this movement, can you talk a little bit about why the museum is really important in being able to tell the story?
Thank you, Rainer. When I was thinking about the N-word story and that little boy who, at 8 years old, was using that term to define me. And as I said, that was my first encounter with that word. And we hear a lot about grooming and indoctrination. But what doesn't get talked about is that there are kids today who continue to be groomed and indoctrinated to embrace white supremacy. That doesn't get talked about. When you're talking about how you're going to take away discussions about race and slavery and so forth, nobody who's making that argument is talking about the ways in which kids are being groomed today and what that's going to mean. When I told the young white guy, you're the ones who are going to be the leaders of this world. If you have been just indoctrinated into the notion of white superiority and supremacy, then you won't care about poverty and inequity and injustice and voting rights and all of those things, because you have been groomed to believe that only you and people like you have the right to those things. So that's one reason for me that it is important. When I think about what it means to have a sense of your place in history, when Elmer and I, and a part of the creating of the Great Blacks in Wax Museum, we went to France. And Elmer said to me, what many people in the U.S. see as French arrogance might simply be having a sense of your place in history and claiming that place and feeling the right to claim that place. And that for people of African descent, for black people, for black Americans, that's a right that we had been denied. And therefore, a part of making sure that a little black kid hasn't bought into the stigma of his color being a negative, because he knows that people who look like him have had tremendous impact on this world, whether it's inventions or medical technology or the fact that the pacemaker was invented by someone who looked like him. To have a sense of that, to have a sense of our music and dance and how creative we are. That matters. And I don't feel that anyone who has any compassion would want our children, whoever those children are, to be denied that.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you so much for being here. Talking about your place in history, I don't know how many, that Absalom Jones is just, I'm the first black clergy person in this church, in this community. And to be a priest, and he was the first black priest, African American. You can tell my age by saying black, because African American is really hard for me. I grew up as a black person in the 70s. But for him, to be the first black priest in the Episcopal Church, because he bought his own freedom, but because he was asked to get up while he was praying, while they were praying, to get up and move to another part of the church. And they all got up, the freedmen and the enslaved, and left and started their own church. And he later became the priest. And then, yeah. I mean, that is so powerful to just have that back there. Can you talk a little bit about the artistry that goes on with that?
Thank you. And I completely agree with you in the impact that those stories have, and that we need to know those stories. And all our children need to know those stories. And we need to share those stories. I talk to kids about that my people came here as a part of the Middle Passage in enslaved ships. But many of your people came on ships as well, but in steerage. And we can make those kinds of connections. And when I talk to this kid about being a leader, I'm talking about being a leader of this country, and therefore having my welfare be just as important as anybody else's. I appreciate your comments, and as I said, I totally agree with you. Our figures, the majority of them, we use pictures. Even for someone who is alive, we have two figures in the museum that are life casted, meaning that the artist came in one case with our Earl Graves. They put the compound over his face, and when they took that away, what they had was the actual face. So that's why Earl Graves looks like Earl Graves. But many of them are sculpted in the same way that you would sculpt a piece of work in a park that's in bronze or whatever. So Absalom Jones was sculpted. And what they do is they start with a clay sculpt. And I get kids to talk to me about what they do with silly putty and so forth to create unicorns and dinosaurs and so forth. And they say they set it out and let it dry and harden. All of the ways you might see a child create that kind of art is a part of that process, but they sculpt it in the image of the person, and then they fire it up under, and that's why temperature isn't as much of a problem as people think, because they're going to have it at just 4,000 degrees or whatever. But it's going to be fired up and hardened. They'll pour the mold in and then take the mold away, and then therefore you've got in wax. They'll put a wax mold in, and when they take that away, then you've got the wax image of that clay. The eyes are made of glass, so they're not like doll's eyes that are made of just whatever, some unusual materials. The teeth for those wax figures that are smiling are, the teeth are made of what's called dental acrylic. So the kids and I talk about the teeth that some that are in the jar, and you know we're talking the same kind of teeth. The hair is, when we started out, the hair was 100% human hair. And it was hair that women, for example, in developing countries, you know, they grow their hair long and then they sell it. They sell it to barbershop, I'm sorry, the hair that would be cut at barbershops and beauty shops, that was sold to wig makers and toupee makers and wax figure makers. Today, the hair could be human or synthetic, in the same way that when we go into to buy the braids or whatever, some of those braids are human hair, some of them are synthetic. I had a young person, and she said, "Human hair? Are you saying that the hair on my head came from somebody else's head?" So, but it could be human hair or synthetic, and whatever kind it is placed in one strand, one hair at a time, and then shaped into the Absalom Jones that you see, or Keith Perrin from FUBU, or the someone with dreadlocks and so forth. And then in some cases, the clothing is the actual clothing of the person. Shirley Chisholm gave us a summer suit and a winter suit. Colin Powell, the Army gave us, it wasn't Colin Powell's uniform, but they gave us an authentic Army uniform. The Dodgers gave us a number 42 for Jackie Robinson and so forth. So all of that combined into what you see. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Martin, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
your time.
Thank
We
you.
loved it. We loved it.
you.
Everybody knows it's the way to the museum. Why don't you tell us the address, just in case some people in the audience don't know?
The museum is at 1601 East North Avenue in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us on the website. Our site is still being worked on, but there's still a lot of information there that can point you to us and to some of the information that you might be looking for. And we welcome your visit.
Thank you.